Right, we're at 1/2 past. So, hello and welcome everyone to this BSBI identification webinar on broom rapes of Britain and Ireland. I'm Sam Thomas. I'm the BSBI's England officer, and I'll be introducing and moderating this session, which will introduce some broom rapes from around the world, then focus on species found in Britain and Ireland and how to identify them. At the end of the presentation, there'll be a Q&A session. Just a few bits of admin first. This session is being recorded, but as it's a webinar, you will not be recorded. Also, with the webinar format, you will have noticed you're automatically muted and not visible to other participants. However, once I turn it on in a minute, you will have access to the chat and Q&A functions. So please put your questions in there during the presentation so you don't forget them. We should run to time, but if we do go over time, then please feel free to drop off at the end. Right, and yeah, finally, and most importantly, it's my pleasure to introduce our main speaker, Chris Thorogood of Oxford Botanic Gardens and Arboretum. Chris is an international broom rape specialist and author of the BSBI Handbook, Broomrapes of Britain and Ireland. We're very lucky to have this opportunity to learn from Chris on what can be a very tricky genus. I'm now going to hand over to Chris, and I will see you again in the Q&A at the end.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sam. And bear with me. Hopefully you can see those slides. See that, Sam?
That's perfect now, yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you for your kind introduction, Sam. And it's my pleasure to be with you all virtually this evening to talk about one of my very favorite groups of plants. I don't really have favorite plants. I'm asked this question as a botanist all the time, and there are so many, it's difficult to pick one out. But certainly as far as groups go, this is one of them. And so in this evening's talk, I'm going to introduce broomrapes as a group. I'm going to talk briefly about why they're important beyond being fascinating. I will then share a few insights into their life cycle and biology, which are actually quite important to understand and identify broomrapes reliably. We'll talk about the taxonomy, and then the main part of the talk is going to be doing a deep dive into some of the detail and the complications around the identification of British and Irish broomrapes specifically. A little bit about me before we dive into this fascinating world of broomrapes. So I'm a botanist, as Sam said, a biologist at University of Oxford Botanic Garden, and I specialise in parasitic plants, particularly these. And I love to paint them as well. So as well as being a scientist, I'm a botanical artist. And when I see extraordinary plants around the world, when I come back to Oxford, I very much like to spend time in a calmer, meditative way after all the excitement of finding the plants, illustrating them, either in watercolors, oils, or pen and ink. And I'm going to start this talk by describing what a broomrape is. And I think for the sake of this talk, it's helpful for us to think of this in very broad terms. So broomrapes belong to the broomrape family, which is the Orobanchaceae, which is a family of parasitic plants. Parasitic plants, as you may know, are those that steal some or all of their nutrition from other green plants. And so you'll notice on this slide an assortment, a collection of plants from this family, all of which lack chlorophyll, and they do not photosynthesize. In fact, they don't even have functional leaves. Their leaves are reduced to small scales. And so as taxonomists, we're somewhat robbed of the useful diagnostics that many plants present us with, for example, in the form of leaves. They're rather what we call reduced or derived in a biological sense. So they belong, as I said, to the broomrape family. And in a strict sense, people refer to broomrapes as belonging to the genus Orobanche, of which those yellowish and blackish spike on the bottom right are examples. But actually, as is often the case with common names for plants, they're used rather inconsistently and in a varied way. And so in a broad sense, you can think of all plants in the Orobanchaceae family that lack chlorophyll as a form, broadly speaking, of broomrape. But as I say, in a strict sense, it's the genus Orobanche, and that's predominantly what I'm going to focus on this evening. I should say, whilst I've got this motley assortment in front of us, that these plants have a far-flung distribution. They're found all over the globe in most biomes, and they've evolved this sort of rather wonderful kaleidoscope of sort of umber, purple, red, orange, and browns, and I think they're so striking and really rather beautiful, and not at all like withered orchids, as people only yesterday, in fact, someone told me he thought one looked like a withered orchid. So I mentioned that broomrapes and their relatives grow in lots of different places around the world, lots of different habitats. So I'll share a couple of examples from different habitats. This one is a particularly rare one called Phacelanthus tubiflorus that I saw in 2018 in the depths of the Daisetsuzan temperate vast forest that covers Hokkaido. And we drove and then trekked for many miles in an eagle-patrolled forest down into the what felt like the abyss of this forest, in a very dark place haunted by mosquitoes, where our clever host pointed to the forest floor, and then on what was like this sort of the abyssal plain of this forest were these curious white tooth-like flowers grimacing back at us from the leaf litter. This particular one is parasitic on a vine called an actinidia, and it's a rather poorly known and poorly understood plant, like so many in this family. That is the case. This is an example of a British and Irish species seen here on the coast of Northern Ireland. In fact, on the cliffs above the Giant's Causeway. It's an example of a species here that has quite a distinct penchant, I would say, for coastal cliffs or occasionally inland limestone habitats. But it's one of these plants that has rather exacting requirements. So you won't find it in any old place in the UK. It prefers the west coast, so you find it in along the west of Scotland, and fairly frequent in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and southwest of England. And it sort of perches precariously, particularly on sea cliffs. It likes a good pinch of salt. It likes a mild winter. And so it's rather exacting, and it's parasitic on thyme, as we'll see later. And it has a rather different ecology, I would say, in the UK to its Mediterranean allies. So this is a plant that you find fairly frequently, I guess, in the central Mediterranean. And I've seen it there in a drier environment on the Grieg and Mackey, if you're familiar with that sort of habitat, those sort of sun-drenched, herb-rich slopes on with sort of ribs of rock poking out of a green mantle. And then you see the broomrapes clinging onto the rocky ledges and edges there. But in the UK, as I say, it grows in a sort of mild, damp environment, quite specifically. Some plants, some broomrapes are picky, and yet they grow in rather different environments in the UK. I'll explain what I mean. So this one is Orobanche picridis, picris broomrape. It has a rather checkered past in terms of its taxonomy, so you'll find it listed under different names in guides to British wildflowers. So you'll sometimes see it's described as Orobanche artemisia campestris, which is a different species, as I'll explain a little bit later. You'll also see the name Orobanche loricata, which is a synonym of this one, but Orobanche picridis is the correct name to use. And it's parasitic almost exclusively in the UK on Picridis hieracioides, which is an ox tongue, rather like the common bristly ox tongue, but less bristly. And as you may know, that plant particularly likes growing in high chalk or high calcium environments. And so on the left is a picture of a rather beautiful habitat in the Isle of Wight, which is one of the few strongholds for Orobanche picridis. And it grows right on the very edge of the cliff on that turf that is bleached dry in summer. This is a very thermophilous species. I've just seen it actually in the Mediterranean a couple of weeks ago, thriving on a sort of baked hot roadside. And so really in the UK, this is the northernmost foothold of its distribution. Perhaps we'll see it expand in the future, but it's really always been a rare plant in the UK and the subject of much misidentification, as we will come on to later, because it's similar to a much more common plant. But as I say, it likes growing on chalk cliffs. And the other place that for the real broomrape aficionados, you will know that it grows is around the White Cliffs of Dover. And there it grows not only on the edges of the cliff, that turf at the top, but it also grows perilously close to the cliff edge and actually on the cliff. So the sort of ledges of the cliff, you can find the plant there. Well, you could if it was safe to abseil down the cliff. And in these health and safety averse times, it's probably not recommended to do so. Though I will say, they grow with a very fine view down on the cliffs of Kent. So this is an environment where the plant has long been known to occur. And just in the last few years, we made an astonishing discovery that Orobanche picridis not only grows in the Isle of Wight and the White Cliffs of Dover, which is more or less the only place that it still occurs or was thought to in the UK. An ecologist got in touch with me via social media a few years ago, and he asked me if he'd identified his broomrape correctly, and he sent me a photograph, and he hadn't, and I recognized instantly that it was Orobanche picridis, and I asked where he'd seen this plant, very curious, and it was actually growing on a private industrial area where he was doing an ecological survey. And I went with Fred Rumsey, who I'm sure many of you will know, and with whom I've had the pleasure of working for decades, in fact. And we were able to verify that this was indeed Orobanche picridis, and we found the largest population of one of Britain's rarest plants that had simply gone quietly under the radar and has probably been there for a very long time, but just has gone unnoticed. And I think there's something rather wonderful about that. I find it rather reassuring that even in environments that are disturbed and seemingly spoiled, you can find beautiful rare plants hiding in plain sight. And that also, even though I as a botanist go to extraordinary places all around the world in pursuit of plants, you don't have to. You can actually find them in rather mundane places such as industrial estates and car parks, as we will see. Perhaps, or not perhaps, surely this is the most extreme environment in which a broomrape or its relatives could possibly grow. This is the desert in Inner Mongolia, from where I've just returned last month in pursuit of one of these plants, as I will show you in a few moments' time. But suffice it to say, these plants really have conquered just about every biome on the planet. So earlier, in the beginning of this talk, we discussed what a broomrape was, and I introduced in a very broad sense the members of the broomrape family that lack chlorophyll. In the science biz, we call those plants holoparasitic. There are hemiparasites, such as mistletoes, which steal some of their food from a tree, but they're also photosynthetic. As you know, they're green, they have leaves. We call those hemiparasites. However, Orobanche and its close relatives are all hollow parasites. So broadly, I mentioned that broomrapes can be thought of as really any hollow parasitic plant in the Orobanchaceae. But in a narrower sense, I said that it was restricted to the genus Orobanche, of which I've put a photograph on the left of a very fine specimen growing in the littoral on the coast of Portugal. But also we can include in that stricter definition the genus Phelipanche as well, of which I've put an example on the right there, growing in a desert. Now, this is a little bit confusing because in many texts, you will see authors including Phelipanche within Orobanche, so they don't recognize it as a separate genus. And actually, even Plants of the World Online, which is generally quite a good go-to for taxonomists, but as you will know, for the different groups you specialize in, it really isn't a go-to for everything, and it's rather unfortunate that they don't recognize the genus Phelipanche. They call everything Orobanche, and actually, I don't think it's particularly useful to lump them in that way, because number one, they fall into very distinct genetic, what we call monophyletic groups. So they are very distinct, but perhaps concerning us in this lecture, they're also morphologically quite distinct. So on the top right of this slide, I've put a picture of a corolla of a broomrape, so the sort of the fused petal tube. And at the base of that, you can see a bract, which is a useful diagnostic, as we'll come on to. And then a little above that, a sort of brownish fang. That's a lobe of the calyx. Then if you look at the example of a Phelipanche beneath it, the bluer thing, you'll see that it has, or hopefully you can see, it has an additional layer of those. These are called bracteoles. So it has the blackish bract at the bottom. Then it has a calyx, which are the brown tooth-like fangs, and then above that it has a bracteole. So it has this extra layer, if you like. And Orobanche doesn't have that, and Phelipanche does. And this is a very good hard and fast way in the field to know if you're looking at an Orobanche or a Phelipanche, and it's a very useful diagnostic character. So generally, those of us who work with these plants, I would say, tends to group these, to recognize these two genera as distinct, Orobanche and Phelipanche. It should also mention toothworts. It would be remiss of me not to in a talk on British broomrapes. My talented PhD student, Sebastian Hatt, produced this rather nice figure on the left that depicts various toothworts. Actually, I think all of the toothworts from around the world. There aren't many of them. And we recently wrote a monograph on that genus. And of these, there are two that occur in the UK. One is native, and I'll come on to these later. That sort of pinkish one, second on the left, Lathraea squamaria, is a fairly frequent plant, particularly growing on hazel, sometimes yew trees in the UK. And then the purple one to the right of it, which is actually native to Central and Southern Europe, but has been introduced as an ornamental. In fact, it even grows in my own garden, about 20 meters from where I'm sitting, where I introduced it, which grows on particularly on willows, but various other things. And then on the right is a species that grows around the Greek-Bulgarian border in Macedonia, and it's a truly spectacular one. One of the highlights of my botanical career, stumbling across this in the hill forests of that part of the world, because unlike our own toothwort, which sort of grows more or less to your ankle, this one grows above your knee. It's really quite spectacular. And the Cistanche, of course, some of my very favorite plants. Here are some enormous specimens from deserts in the Middle East that I saw a few years ago. These can grow up to your waist. They're really chunky, great parasites that seem to appear as if by magic, or a sort of magician's trick of the desert, because in these seemingly lifeless environments where the roots of their hosts grow for many meters underground, all of a sudden these these extraordinary parasites just sort of burst out of the desert floor in this sort of injection of colour that really stops you in your tracks. And these are some of the spectacular ones that I've just returned from Inner Mongolia to see. So these all belong, in fact, though they look different, to the same species, Cistanche deserticula, which is one of the very largest, and it really is a monstrous, although rather beautiful thing. And I just briefly want to dwell on this plant because I mentioned or promised at the beginning that I'd say something about why these plants are important. And in a fast changing world and a changing climate and spreading deserts occupy a vast surface of our land and are spreading. This is a plant that can actually be cultivated and is a useful source of starch, food, and herbal medicine. And it can be grown in places where pretty much nothing else can be. And I've just come back from meeting farmers who are learning how to grow this extraordinary plant. You can see on the left there, one of these farmers who dug this hole in front of me in the soft sand and disappeared into it because it's over 2 meters deep by the time he'd finished. And then they excavate these extraordinary underground stems of Cistanche. And you can see the one there on the right that has the dimensions of a snake. It's a veritable plant python that they conjure out of the sand. It's a truly extraordinary thing. Here's another example of one that they dug up, which looks almost gruesome in its appearance. A little something on the life cycle of Orobanche before we go through the various species, and I think it's useful to understand this, the fundamentals of how a broomrape grows. On the left there, these are much magnified seen from under a microscope, are the seeds of a broomrape, which are absolutely minute, rather like orchid seed. They are tiny, dust-like seeds that are spread by winds and to an extent by rain, then washed into crevices. And they can sit dormant and lie in wait for many decades, if not potentially longer. And only when the conditions are very exact will they germinate. And by exact, I mean they must be in the presence of particular chemical cues produced by the roots of the host. So plants' roots are all the time exchanging molecules. So there's a sort of stream of vocab, if you will, coming out of plants' leaves and roots all the time that we can't see, smell, or detect. That's used, for example, in communication between plants and with fungi. It's an extraordinary and fascinating phenomenon. And broomrapes have, in an evolutionary sense, eavesdropped on this communication. And they've evolved to respond to specific chemical cues produced by the right host. If the host is right, and it isn't always, sometimes they germinate and they're unable to attach. But if the host is correct, they form an attachment to the host root that you can see third from left. And then again, if in a compatible interaction, it will then start to draw off food and reserves and form what we call a tubercle. And it also reconfigures the world around it in a cellular sense. So you can see underneath the tubercle that swelling of the host root. Parasitic plants are fascinating in this respect because they cause changes anatomically to the host. So this is a cell, what we call a hyperplasia. And then the next one along, you can see an Orobanche developing what look like roots. These, in fact, they're not roots. These are extensions of tissue in which what we call a myeloplast, starch storage organs, are deposited. So it's like it's sort of drawing down, almost like secretly plugging itself into the grid and stealing electricity and then storing them in batteries, if you like. It's sort of putting down reserves of starch in these root-like structures. And then when it's ready, and this varies with the species, in fact, it will send up a flowering spike. So the flowering spike here is Orobanche minor, and this plant can complete its whole life cycle within a year, in a few months, in fact. there are many species, most of the British ones that I know, and we've grown most of them at Oxford Botanic Garden now. They take 2 years to grow. So if you planted the seeds now, they would not flower next summer, but they would flower the summer after. In terms of their ecology and their pollination, this varies, of course, with the habitat and the place. There are some rather beautiful, lovely examples of pollination, such as the Sphingidae hawk moths that visit Cistanche during the day in North Africa and the Canary Islands. Meanwhile, our own British species attract rather few insects, in fact, for various reasons, I suppose. But I do regularly see bees visiting broomrapes. But it's also worth mentioning that there are some species that are obligate outcrosses. So that means they must attract insects or they won't be pollinated. So clove-scented broomrape, Orobanche caryophyllacea is one such example. So if it's a bad year for insects, no seed. Orobanche hederae in the middle here, the photograph, is predominantly selfing, so it doesn't really matter whether an insect visits or not to some extent. It will produce seeds anyway. And then the one on the right, Orobanche picridis, is rather somewhere in between. It sort of selfs a bit, but insects certainly help it along a bit. And in a good summer, you'll get more seed. Okay, so onto the interesting stuff then. Identification challenges. This is what I particularly love. And I really enjoy at this time of year when I get, in a nice way, sort of inundated with people's requests for identifying curious broomrapes up and down the country. Here are 3 examples of plants that look similar. On the left there is what you might know of as carrot broomrape, the subspecies maritima of common broomrape that is the sort of unequivocally native form of an otherwise rather cosmopolitan plant that grows on cliffs and dunes around exclusively around the south coast of the UK. And this is a photograph of one growing near Lulworth and Durdle Door, now a very famous and popular tourist destination, where this plant grows happily on the cliffs, parasitizing the sea carrot. And this particular specimen looks rather similar to Orobanche picridis, as does this in the middle. This is a specimen that through DNA sequencing we identified to be Orobanche minor, just the normal common form that you probably have growing near you if you're joining us from somewhere in the south of England, and if not anywhere in the UK, it's relatively frequent. And this one fooled me because I thought perhaps it was a hybrid with Orobanche picridis, but it wasn't. Meanwhile, on the right is an example of a bona fide Orobanche picridis. So plants in this particular group can be very confusing, particularly small or poor specimens. I will talk about how you can identify them shortly. And if you weren't convinced by the last example, look at this one on the left. That plant on the far left is Orobanche minor. Next to it is Orobanche picridis. And then the photograph on the right is what we identified to be a first generation hybrid of Orobanche picridis and minor, spontaneous. I have artificially created hybrids of these plants, so it can be done. But I should say hybrids, in our experience, are exceptionally rare in the field. We really don't come across these very often at all. It may be that in certain parts of Southern Europe where broomrapes are more common, perhaps so are their hybrids, but generally we don't see them a lot. And so these aren't really a cause for concern when it comes to identification. But in this population in South Wales, where we have Orobanche minor and picridis growing in their thousands and overlapping, there's plenty of opportunity for pollen transfer between them, and occasionally we do find these hybrids. But you can see the plants really are similar. When they're in bud, they're quite easy to tell apart, these two species. When they're in full bloom, you can just about do it. Once they've gone over, I have to say it's pretty much impossible, even for a broomrape specialist, to tell some of these species apart with 100% confidence, because many of the diagnostics that you would rely on in full flower have gone by the time the plant is dead and dried. And so sometimes we pore over herbarium specimens, desperately seeking diagnostics that might help us, and we can sometimes have a fairly confident view of what a plant is, but in certain closely related groups of species, it's all but impossible once the plants have finished blooming. So you can see they really can be a tricky group, and Sam said in his introduction that these are notoriously difficult. In the UK, it tends not to be that difficult, as I hope I'll persuade you by the end of this talk. If you go to the Mediterranean, it really can be exceptionally difficult, but I find that all the more satisfying, actually, because we all like a challenge. So some of the diagnostics that I mentioned, here I've done surgery on a specimen of Orobanche minor growing at Oxford Botanic Garden. On the left there is, as I'm sure you'll know, an inflorescence, a collective of flowers on a stem. And moving to the right then, the first thing I would say is that the corolla profile is quite important when it comes to diagnosing, identifying different broomrapes, and I'll return to that. The bract morphology beneath that sort of brownish hairy structure in middle left, that sits beneath the corolla, and it's important to know whether that grows, whether it greatly exceeds the corolla or it falls short of the tip of the corolla. And there are various other characters around the bract, how broad it is, how narrow it is, that kind of thing. But the length is quite important. Then next to that is a lobe from the calyx. And the calyx can be bifid or toothed, so it can form two parts, or it can form one. In this case, you can see it's almost forming another tooth on the left, but it hasn't quite. And in this species, in Orobanche minor, it can be entire or it can be bifid, so it's not awfully helpful. And then I've dissected a corolla, and in order to see the filaments and to understand, are they hairy at the base or are they not hairy? And where exactly are they joined at the base? Are they joining the corolla right at the very base, as they are in some species, or a couple of millimeters away? And understanding those characters is very important in some species. And then stigma color can also be helpful. Here are some of those things again in diagrammatic form. There's the stigma on the left. In this case, the stigma has lobes that are set apart. Sometimes they're contiguous. Then a front view of the corolla. What is the shape of the lobes? Are they pointed or are they blunt? Here they're blunt. Are they toothed or are they entire? Here they're toothed. And then underneath that, you can see in my diagram the position of the stamens, which in this case are a little bit away from the base of the corolla, and they're obviously hairy. And then you can see two different corollas in profile, one flatter than the other, one with an evenly arched curve to the dorsal line. Okay, so I want to briefly mention some of the diagnostics that I think are very useful, and some of those that I think are sometimes used a bit too much. I'll explain why. If I wanted to identify a broomrape in the field, particularly one of the difficult species or in an environment where there's more than one species growing, on the top right is a list of things that I would be looking at. The corolla in profile is very important. Does the dorsal line at the back of the corolla curve, or is it flat? Or is it geniculate? Does it have a sort of knee bends towards the tip? You can see on the far left in those diagrams, hopefully, some subtly different dorsal lines of the corolla. Subtle they may be, but they may make a big difference with the species. What are the corolla dimensions? So although broomrapes will vary in their vigor to a lesser or greater extent, depending on the host and the environment, generally the corolla itself, even on a small individual, is a little bit more constant. And so the dimensions are very important. There are some species that have far smaller flowers than others. So in isolation, that's not a fact that would identify a broomrape reliably, but in combination with other factors, it's very important. The lower and the upper lip lobes, are they, well, if we take the upper lip first, are they two distinct lobes, or are they joined into a hood? And then the lower lobes, are they equal in size, or is the middle one largest? Are they pointed or are they blunt? Are they toothed? Are they wavy edged? Calyx length and morphology I've already mentioned. Is it toothed, for example, or not? So it's bifid or entire. Filament, hairiness, and insertion point, and then the stigma lobes. In some species, this can be helpful to understand whether they're joined or they're separate. Beneath this, I have a list of things that can be useful, but sometimes they're not actually. Stigma color. I mean, I'd say about 70% of the time it's pretty helpful. And so, for example, ivy broomrape mostly has a yellow stigma. A common broomrape mostly has a pink stigma. But common broomrape can have a yellow stigma, and ivy broomrape can have a red stigma. And so when we're talking about colours that are continuously variable, there's quite a lot of room for error. Moreover, the colour within a species can be quite variable across its range. So I've seen different forms of a given species in other countries where the stigma colour really can be quite different. So it's useful to know, but I certainly wouldn't use that fact in isolation. And I think it's been rather over-egged in some of the descriptions in floras. Beneath this is a rather controversial one, which is host. If you know the host with absolute certainty, this can be a very useful diagnostic. But it's very difficult to know the host with certainty. One of the ones that's frequently muddled is ivy broomrape with common broomrape. The reason being that the broomrape can appear several meters away from where its host is. And so unless you actually dig it up and excavate it, you wouldn't necessarily know for sure what the host is. Moreover, these plants can grow on different hosts. I've grown Orobanche crenata on ivy, even though that's not really reported generally. Meanwhile, Orobanche minor can grow on all sorts of things. Dimensions, again, it's going to be continuously variable, but there are some species that really are a lot bigger, chunkier than others. Similarly, ecology, there are some that you know they'll only grow on a sea cliff, give or take, whereas there are others that will grow in very different environments. Photographs are helpful, but it can be impossible to tell from a photo alone. Sometimes people share photos with me, particularly of plants in the Mediterranean. And honestly, unless you've seen some of the aspects in the list above, which you really have to dissect a flower to see, I'm very cautious about saying with certainty what a plant is. I think there are some plants that we have to accept you just can't identify reliably from a photograph alone. So on to some of the British species then, and how to identify them. This is Orobanche alba. Here are some photographs in Northern Ireland where it grows on some beautifully sort of bleak sea cliffs that are blasted by plumps of rain, as they say locally, all year round. And then on the right is an example that we grew at Oxford Botanic Garden using the seed from this population. This is a pretty easy plant to identify in the UK. It's rather unmistakable, in fact, because it's got this strong reddish pigmentation. We call this one forma rubra in the UK. It smells, it's scented as well. It's got a pleasing, it's difficult to describe broomrape smells. Some describe it a bit like cloves or carnations. Those descriptors are also given to other species, but it's a nice, pleasing smell. It has a rather bell-shaped and abruptly curved corolla, and it's parasitic on thyme. I think this is one that's really rather unmistakable and difficult to mistake with any other. And that's why we were confident when Mike Fay at Kew, to his astonishment, found a population growing in his garden in Wales, that this was in fact Orobanche alba, and it's rather a mystery as to how it got to this to this area where it had not been recorded before. It has a strongly western distribution, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, so it really does like a mild winter, and so you find it very much along the western half of the UK, and it's fairly frequent around much of Ireland particularly, and the top part of the northwest of Scotland as well, and it's a very beautiful thing. The next one on our list is Orobanche caryophyllacea, the clove-scented broomrape, and this is famously a rarity, and it's another one of these plants that has a much more southerly distribution that just about gets its foothold into the UK, and it grows pretty much exclusively around the golf course rough of Sandwich Bay, famously. So you could easily get a photograph of this plant with a golfer in the background, and it's very happy there. I have seen it on the cliff top scrub above Samphire Hoe in Kent, where it achieves a much greater, laxer form. But by far, the stronghold for this plant is down in Sandwich. And it varies fairly considerably year on year. And I think that's because it's very much dependent on pollinators for setting seed. And so if a certain population doesn't yield much seed in the future, that means that you'll get gaps in the population, and it's probably quite respondent to changes in weather as well. But I haven't been down to see it this year, but perhaps someone on the call has. It grows quite close to the lizard orchid, so and generally this plays second fiddle to the to the botanists seeking to photograph the lizard orchid, but it's a lovely thing to and well worth the visit to Sandwich Bay to go and see. This plant is Orobanche crenata, which infests bean fields, as you can see from Fred Rumsey's photo on the left in Kent. It's a rather beautiful thing. It smells of carnations. It's another scented one, and it's unmistakable again because it produces almost pure white corollas with purple veins, with a big open throat and a strong fragrance if it's in full bloom. So it's really unmistakable, and it grows on peas and beans. And actually, it's been growing for decades around Cranham in Essex, where it once appeared in huge numbers many years ago in a pea or a bean field, and then it sort of spilled out into the fallow lands, and it still grows on the Vicia tetrasperma there. And I went to go and see it there about 15-20 years ago, but I haven't been since. But since that time, several incursions have been found in Kent. So this is a plant that is obviously expanding beyond its range, and it seems to thrive in our East Anglian Mediterranean summers. And it's perhaps one to look out for because it's a potential pest on crops. This one is Orobanche elatior or elatior, which is, I would never call it common, but at the same time, it's one of these broomrapes that you can stumble across new locations for. I every so often, once every couple of years, I find a location that I don't think has been recorded, and it grows exclusively on chalk. You find it in chalk pits on the side of on roadsides, chalk, on the chalk, on very shallow turf typically, and in nature reserves on said chalk. And it grows in a sort of band along the chalk from Cambridgeshire and Essex across through to Oxfordshire. It's not too rare where I live in Oxford, and Wiltshire area and down to the Salisbury Plain. So you find it from sort of across the southern England, and occasionally you find it on the south coast. It's rather rare actually on the chalk in Kent, but it does grow there. So it sort of crops up, and again, it's a rather unmistakable plant in that it produces a many flowered dense spike, typically of orangey brown flowers with rather long bracts that sort of recurve on themselves. And the base of the stem tends to have lots of bracts. There's sometimes a yellow form that's rarer, you can see on the right, but predominantly it's orangey brown, and it grows on greater knapweed in these chalky conditions. The only plant you might mistake it for is greater broomrape, but when I stress the characters of that species, you'll know that it's really rather different. It's a very handsome species, and it's one of those ones that always gives me a thrill. This one is rather similar in many respects, but you're unlikely to come across it, and therefore you won't mistake it. It's flowering now in Oxford Botanic Garden if you want to see it, and it's only got a few days left, I'd say. And it grows on Petacetes, so butterbur and its relatives. And it's quite happy growing next to the River Cherwell, where it gets flooded every winter, and it still seems to come up. This is native to Central Europe, and it's been grown in Oxford Botanic Garden as a curiosity since about the 80s or 90s, and it still comes up most years. Now, this was a revelation to Fred Rumsey and to me when we were researching for our handbook. Orobanche gracilis is not a British native. It's a Mediterranean species. You find it in scrub and open woods, particularly in Spain and Portugal and Italy. And it's rather characteristic or distinctive because of its pale bell-shaped corolla with a dark red interior and yellow stigma. So there's a photo of a plant I saw in Portugal on the right, and here is one that cropped up in Wiltshire a few years ago that was seen on someone's private farmland, and at the time I believe it was thought to be Orobanche alba, but when we looked at the photo, it's pretty clear, even though photos aren't the best form of diagnosis, that this is Orobanche gracilis, and we've really no idea how it got there. It grows in sort of mountain pastures as well in southern Europe on pea relatives, sort of lotus and things like that. So this is a real mystery. One spike was found and never rediscovered, but maybe this is the sort of thing that we might see more of in the future, with a changing climate and the introduction of seed mixes, or who knows, but this is certainly a mystery for us. Orobanche hederae is, I would say, increasing. The data looks like it's an increasing plant. I think its official status is nationally scarce, but it seems to be anything but that in many parts of southern England anyway. And it grows predominantly on ivy, as its common name, ivy broomrape, suggests. It's very common in the city of Bristol. It grows all around Clifton and the Clifton Suspension Bridge and Lee Woods, and it's a real stronghold for the plant, but actually really quite common in most of southwest England and Wales. And then it's cropping up all over southern England, particularly near Botanic Gardens. So this grows along the River Cherwell, where it's spilled out from Oxford Botanic Garden. It grows outside Cambridge. It grows outside Kew. So where it's introduced as a curiosity, it sort of gets out and then establishes itself. And it's very easy, actually, to distinguish. It generally grows in fairly large numbers in ivy, and it's quite unmistakable. It has a narrow pinched corolla, as you can see top left, and it has a yellow stigma most of the time. But it can vary. So this one in the middle is a yellowish form that was growing in the Bristol area. And then on the right is an example of one that actually is growing on a cultivated eryngium. This is, in fact, because the common ancestor of this and its sister species, Orobanche amethystia, also, will have presumably grown on sea holly or eryngium, because that's what its sister species grows on. So it still obviously has the ability that it inherited from that ancestry to grow on that other host, but you don't often see it on that. It will also grow incidentally on a tetrapanax and a fatsia, and you can quite easily grow it in your garden if you were so inclined. If you dig it well into the roots of one of those plants, but particularly ivy, then 2 years later you should see the results. This is Orobanche lucorum, which again you are unlikely to mistake with any other, because you're unlikely to find it. The only place it really grows is in, well, we've got one in Oxford Botanic Garden where it was grown years ago and then disappeared, but we've reintroduced it. And it also grows in Leicestershire, in an ornamental bed of an agricultural college on a Mahonia, where I think it must have been introduced again as some sort of curiosity, and it's persisted. And it's recognizable by its sort of orange clumped stems growing underneath the shrub of its host. I promised Sam that I wasn't going to talk for too long, and here I am still going at 20 past, but now
we can give it a few more minutes, Chris. Don't worry.
Thanks, Sam, because I'm getting on to the most interesting ones now. Orobanche minor. So this is a fascinating plant, I think, because in the UK, we have a bit of a stronghold for interesting forms of this. And I think that's because we have both native forms and introduced ones. So here you can see Fred Rumsey in the background of some rather sturdy specimens of Orobanche minor. On the right, there is a much more typical form. But we see lots of different forms of Orobanche minor, subspecies minor. On the left here is a common yellow form, elatior, and you find that quite often muddled up with the normal purple form in various locations. There on the right is a particularly dark purple form I saw. But when we get into the really interesting forms, this is one that it doesn't have a taxonomic rank, other than it belongs to that yellow form elatior. But Fred and I have always been interested in this because it grows specifically in docks in South Wales, and it produces a very dense, congested globose head. And originally it was supposed that this belongs to the form on the herbarium sheet on the right, which is picridis, which was recorded from the Channel Islands centuries ago and has never been seen since, growing on Hyperchiris. But actually our work shows that it really belongs not to the sea carrot group, which Hyperchiris does, but onto the clover parasitizing group, the normal form of Orobanche minor. So I mean, this is the kind of plant that botanists obsess over, and other people wonder why we do, but it's just a rather unusual thing. And when you grow it in cultivation, it maintains its congested globose form. So there we are. This one, however, does have a taxonomic rank. This is a sea holly specific one, Orobanche minor pseudamethistia, that we described from Sandwich in Kent. So it grows in the same locality as the clove-scented broomrape, and it's specific to sea holly. Our research that goes back many years on Orobanche minor shows that in fact we have to go beyond traditional species concepts sometimes to describe these plants. So there are forms of Orobanche minor that are specific to a certain host, and they have rather trifling morphological characteristics that in and of themselves are not enough to tell them apart. So this plant tends to have rather flattish backed corollas and a strong purple pigmentation, and it often grows in clumps, and it has a swollen base to the stem. But those things are, they're not sort of strong enough in and of themselves to tell this apart, but its ecology and its host specificity and its genetics are what are important. And just to mention that for a long time, this plant was confused with Orobanche amethystia. And some of the, if you've got old enough books on your shelves, they will still describe this as occurring in the UK because it shares some of those characters and it grows on sea holly and other eryngiums. But it's not, it's a different species, and we don't have this one in the UK. It grows from the west coast of France southwards. Meanwhile, here is a familiar and very common form of Orobanche minor that we described on the same basis that it's a host-specific race of Orobanche. This one, in fact, if you collect the seeds of this, you can grow it on a brachioglottis in your garden. But if you try to grow it on a clover, which is the common host of Orobanche minor, it won't grow. So this is a specific form of the Orobanche that grows on this host, that tends to be planted outside retail parks, housing estates, and particularly IKEA, I found, and service stations. So next time you get petrol or go to IKEA or do the shopping, do take a moment to look in the undergrowth of this brachioglottis shrub, which they love to plant because it doesn't need any water. And quite often, I'd say about 1 in 10, at least where I live, you might have a good chance of finding this particular plant, which has a many-flowered, dense stem and a clumped habit, often. And just to say, from the beginning, I mentioned that I liked painting these, so I also like to recreate some of the strange habitats that these plants occur in. So here is one outside IKEA. This form is very subtle. This is Orobanche minor var compositarum, which grows in the south of England, particularly in the southeast, and it grows on composites, so particularly things like crepis. And it was described centuries ago from Bedford, and it has suberect very narrow corolla. It's not a particularly clear distinction, and you sometimes find forms you think, oh, is it this one or is it not? But on the left there is a photograph of one that conforms well to type. There are records of Orobanche artemisia campestris in Suffolk. I think Freds is rather more convinced that this one is that species than I am. I suspect that it may have been confused with Orobanche minor. We don't know because we haven't looked at the DNA, and it's not possible to say from a herbarium specimen, as I mentioned at the beginning. But it's a very handsome parasite of Artemisia that grows in this part of the UK. So, you know, it's a possibility that this plant has grown or maybe does grow in the UK. And why did I mention that just now? I guess because of its confusion. Sorry, I'm all over the place. Because of its confusion with Orobanche minor. So moving on to a better, more robust subspecies of Orobanche, one that we know occurs in the UK and that is native, is this one, subspecies maritima. And the best way to identify this is by the yellow bosses at the base of its corolla, and its affinity for sea carrots, which is Daucus carota subspecies gomifera, which grows on these often calcareous sea cliffs. It's a lovely thing, but it too can be confusing at the extremities of its range. We found evidence of hybridization with the native form of Orobanche minor. So in the middle there, I would say is a lovely, that's Fred's photo, a beautiful example of Orobanche minor subspecies maritima that looks just like it should. On the right there is one that we found in Wales that, you know, it looks a bit like maritima, but it looks a bit like minor. And I think the reality is that there's been quite a lot of gene flow between these plants where the populations merge over the years. And they are also similar and closely related to this separate species, Orobanche Lathraea, which grows around the Mediterranean. And I suspect that there is a coastal lineage of plants that locally may comprise different taxa and grow on different hosts that all belong to this widespread coastal lineage of plants that grows from the Mediterranean all the way up to the south coast of Britain. Orobanche picridis has long been confused with Orobanche minor. And as I showed you earlier on in the talk, they can look very similar. But look how the corolla on the top left there has a very straight dorsal line and then a correct, like a little inflection at the tip. And it has a lot of very, very slender filiform calyx lobe and a long, slender bract that kind of falls down beneath the flower. And often in a good specimen, it can be really quite white and quite a beautiful thing. But in poorer specimens, those clear diagnostics start to blur, I have to say. Those down on the coast of Kent have a very narrow stem, as you can see on the left there. Once in a while, you'll find a yellow one in the Isle of Wight, although that has no name because it's not been seen often enough to have got one, but it should be former lutea, I would argue. And it's quite consistent across its range. So there's one I saw 2 weeks ago at a family wedding in Italy where I had to stop on the roadside to look at this lovely specimen of Orobanche picridis. And you can see it's quite similar to the British form. And it grows down in Holland occasionally on a sea holly, as Ted Smith sent me this lovely photo of one. And I've seen it near sea holly in the UK, but I don't think I've ever seen it on sea holly. Meanwhile, in France, it also grows in ruderal waste places, just like it does in South Wales. So this is a plant that, despite its rarity, can actually grow in some unexpected disturbed environments. I'm coming to the end now, but I have to introduce Orobanche rapum-genistae because this is an interesting case of a plant that was once much more common. So this used to be distributed, well, I would say actually quite common across the UK. And now, although it's widespread across much of the UK, it's really contracted within its range and really rather rare. So it's extinct in Oxfordshire, for example, the county I'm joining you from this evening. And it's extinct in many of its former locations, and we really don't know why. It's a parasite of broom and sometimes gorse, and it produces big fat brown stems. It's our largest species. And the key diagnostic here is, if you can see the stigma on the top left, the lobes are divergent. They're not at all touching. It produces these very distinct yellow lobes, and it has a slightly unpleasant smell about it as well. But it's rather unmistakable. And there's every chance that you might find a colony of this that hasn't been reported or not for some time. So if you do encounter this in a place that you think it might not be known, I think it's well worth letting your vice county recorder know about it. And once in a while, you find a rare yellow form, which is form of flavescens. Orobanche reticulata is a very rare plant that grows only as a native in Yorkshire in the UK, on the magnesian limestone, including next to an A road. There's a population that, if you scramble under a hedge, you can find it sort of with the traffic thundering past you. It's a rather beautiful plant and quite robust, and a mystery to all of us why it's so rare, given it parasitizes thistles that seem to occur everywhere. But we've just had it flower for the first time at Oxford Botanic Garden. And so if you're in the area, I would encourage you to go and see it before it finishes in the next few days. And finally, the Phelipanches. So this is Phelipanche purpurea, which is yarrow broomrape. It's unmistakable for its calyx morphology that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. It's quite clearly a Phelipanche, not an Orobanche. It's blue coloration. There's no other native blue one like this in the UK, and it grows on yarrow. So there's little room for error with this one. Its relatives occasionally crop up as casual weeds. So Phelipanche aegyptiaca once in a while might grow on someone's tomato in a greenhouse or something. And then Phelipanche ramosa used to frequent hemp fields. And now really, I think the only places you'd find it are in our Botanic Garden. And I think it's disappeared from Cambridge and Kew. So that may be the only place, more or less, you can find it. And Lathraea squamaria, the toothwort that I mentioned at the beginning, which we're at the wrong time of year for now. So it's perfect, actually, that this talk is in June, because every other species I've mentioned you can go out and find, more or less, whereas this one is long gone. This one finished flowering sort of March, April time under hazel and beech, and it's quite common across the UK. Whereas this one, as I mentioned at the beginning, is an introduced one that grows on particularly willows, and you see in botanic gardens, ornamental gardens, and sometimes it spills out. So, for example, Worley Place in Essex, it's done so. And finally, just to mention, if you want to know more about the British broomrapes, there's our handbook that Sam Carney mentioned at the beginning. And then next year, this may not be the final cover, we've written a Broomrapes of the World book, which will be published by Kew, which introduces to many of the more complex ones in the Mediterranean. But with that, I think I'll leave it there. And if I've not outstayed my welcome, I'm very happy to take questions.
Thanks, Chris. That was really fascinating. I'm very much looking forward to that Broomrapes of the World book. That will be gorgeous, I'm sure. Yeah, we're running a few minutes over, which was worth it to get in all those ones at the end there, I think.
It seems inevitable.
Yeah, no worries. It happens. We've just got a couple of questions in the chat.
Sure.
So as we said, we'd have a Q&A. We'll give them a quick go. The first of which is why what we've got on the screen now, the beautifully normally red Orobanche alba is called alba, e.g. white.
Yeah. So that's because this is Orobanche alba is mainly whitish. So if you find it in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe and the Mediterranean, it's often a pale yellow or whitish form, and the majority of forms of it are. Ours is a sort of red form outpost. So this is Orobanche alba, meaning white, but forma rubra, meaning red. So it's a bit of a quirk of taxonomy that it's a red-white broomrape, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's a red form of a predominantly whitish plant.
Yeah, that's just taxonomy and nomenclature for you, isn't it?
I'm afraid so.
Yeah. And then we've got, as a parasite, is O. crenata, the bean broomrape, affected by the herbicides used in most conventional crops?
No, actually. it's a really pernicious weed where it grows, and it forms it causes massive destruction of crops in parts of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and it's a very unwelcome plant. And it's very difficult to control. And really, if you're a pea or a bean farmer and you find this pest, the best advice is to grow something else. It's really difficult to eradicate. So beautiful and fascinating though it is, and I'd certainly travel to go and see it, and I might try and do so this summer. If I were a farmer, it would not be so welcome. Although in Italy, where I've just returned from, it is actually eaten as a vegetable. That's an interesting aside.
That is, I didn't know that. I imagine, yeah. Right, we don't have time really for all of these. I will skip a couple and say quickly, since it's so fascinating that you're growing so many of them at Oxford, do you have any specific advice in general on growing them from seed?
Yes, more than I can say quickly. So what I would say is dig the seeds well into the soil. So if you're growing ivy broomrape, for example, dig at least 15 centimeters, as if you're planting a big bulb, down into the roots, and then bury it, and then wait 2 years. And if you put enough seed in there and the host's happy and everything else works, then you should get results. They are a bit hit and miss. We've been growing them for years, and sometimes you can plant 10 pots of broomrapes and do everything the same, and 3 of them will come up beautifully and 7 won't. And there doesn't seem to be any science to explain it. So we're sometimes scratching our heads as well. But that's part of their appeal, I think. If they were easy, we wouldn't be so interested in them.
No, they are very enigmatic like that. It's part of what makes them so fascinating.
Yeah.
Right. I think we could carry on for ages, but we're going to have to call this to a close at this point. So just to say thank you very much again. We're getting some great feedback already through on the chat. I think everyone found that really useful and fascinating. This talk will be uploaded to the BSBI YouTube channel probably sometime next week. So you can catch it again then or share it with people who might have missed it. And that's it, really. Just to say thank you all for coming, and thanks again, Chris, for presenting.
The pleasure was mine. Thanks very much for joining me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks all. Good night.